So I don't know about anyone else here, but I am really looking forward to September 8th. Why, you might ask? Because on September 8th, Stephen Colbert is taking over for David Letterman on The Late Show. And I'm really, really curious to see what the new Stephen is going to be like. So of course, when I saw an article about Colbert in GQ magazine floating around social media this week, I had to read it. And I don't know how many of you have read this article, but when I read it, I was really surprised. What I didn't know about Colbert, and what I would have never guessed in a million years, is that he is the youngest of 11 children, and that when he was 10, his father and two of his brothers who were closest to him in age died in a plane crash. Now, what I did know about Colbert is that he's a deeply committed Roman Catholic, and that his faith plays a major role in his life. And so upon hearing about this personal tragedy, it would be easy to assume that it was his faith that gave him the strength to carry on in the face of this loss. I mean, isn't that kind of what we think of when we think about faith as a shield, like Paul describes it? But it's interesting that this isn't actually how Colbert describes his experience. Colbert instead says that what he learned, or what he leaned on in the face of tragedy, was a combination of his mother and an inescapable impulse to be grateful for life. The world is so lovely, he says in the article, and even though he has faced tragedy, he cannot help but feel joy. And then he goes on. That act, that impulse to be grateful, wants an object, and that object I call God. So I want to observe something about this. It isn't that Colbert has a deep Catholic faith that told him how to deal with his tragedy. It's that he had a deep, meaningful experience, an urge towards gratitude, which he couldn't shake even in the face of tragedy. And then that experience became the basis of his faith. That faith, he goes on to explain, helps him to make sense of the world. It gives him a kind of framework or a lens through which he examines his own life, but it originates from that experience. It's a bottom-up faith, not a top-down one. A few weeks ago, those of you who were here at the beach had the privilege of hearing my much more eloquent wife preach. And in her sermon, she talked a bit about our experience last month on the Isle of Iona in Scotland. Since that trip, I've been really challenged to think about faith and the church a bit differently. So those of you who have heard me at Saugatuck the last few weeks might find some of this familiar. I've been trying to reimagine church not as an activity that we engage in, but as a community that we belong to. And I've been imagining church as a community that's united by our shared experiences. And like Colbert's experience of God in this inescapable impulse to be grateful for life, it's the experience of God in our own lives that we share with one another as the church. When we pay attention to those sacred moments, when we intentionally cultivate those experiences of God, they can shape our view of and our interactions with the world around us. They can become a framework through which we live our lives, and this framework is what we call faith. Now, this sounds nice, but we all know that life is messy. There's always something else to do, another obstacle to tackle, an unexpected twist in the road to navigate. But that just makes these foundational experiences of God all the more important, I think. That the gravity of those sacred moments gives us an anchor, even in the midst of stormy seas. Paul describes this anchor with the image of armor. A desire for truth, justice, and peace. These are drawn from our fundamental experiences, from those raw impulses that move us at our core. In the face of turmoil, we're drawn to look for truth, to seek justice, to find some semblance of peace. And it's from those fundamental experiences, from those anchors in our lives, that the framework of faith starts to emerge. Like our lives themselves, the development of faith is a process. It's a process born out of our raw experiences, shaped by our triumphs and our tragedies, and grounded in those sacred moments where we find God at work. And as it grows, as the anchor becomes more stable or the armor is fit more securely, faith begins to shape how we respond to new experiences. Paul describes this new role as a shield defending us against arrows. New challenges and opportunities, new tragedies and triumphs start to be filtered through that shield. And that's important. Having faith as a lens or a filter or a shield standing between the highs and lows of life and our own selves can make a huge difference to how we live our lives and how we handle those tragedies and those triumphs. But I can't help but circle back to how Colbert describes his own journey. Not that his faith was the starting point through which he interpreted his tragedy, but that his inescapable experience of God in the impulse to be grateful gave rise to that faith. It's those foundational experiences, that need for truth, for justice, for peace, that starts us off. It's wrestling with where we see God on the one hand and where we see pain and tragedy on the other. It's feeling that inescapable impulse to be grateful for life. If there's one thing that I learned while Rebecca and I were at Iona, it's how important it is to stop and look for those experiences, to reflect on those sacred moments where we find God at work in our lives, because it's in recognizing them for what they are. It's in dropping these holy anchors and clothing ourselves in this spiritual armor that we find the strength to pick up the shield of faith in the first place.